Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be leaving the main highway, so to speak, and taking a detour into a territory that's really defined by red, rugged rock. It's south and east of the Dead Sea.
hmm
We are diving deep into Mount Seir and the people who claimed it, the Edomites.
And this might sound like, a pretty obscure historical journey.
It does a little bit.
But the story of Mount Seir is absolutely critical if you want to understand God's broader rule over the entire world. We often read about these nations on the, let's say, the periphery of Israel's story, and we sort of treat them like footnotes.
Right.
But their history is actually a powerful demonstration of divine governance. I mean, God's real operational control over things like rival families, over national pride, and especially over the borders of the world.
And that's exactly why the material we're diving into is so compelling. It establishes this massive overarching frame right from the get-go, drawing its mission statement from Acts chapter 17.
This history isn't just, ancient trivia. It's a living demonstration of the fact that God sets the times and boundaries of the nations.
So that people might seek him and find him.
Exactly.
And when you adopt that perspective, that God is literally determining where nations rise and fall for the explicit purpose of drawing people to himself, it just fundamentally changes how you read the history of Seir.
How so?
Well, it shifts the story from being just about geopolitical conflict to being a deep spiritual narrative. And it's loaded with historical clarity and ultimately great hope for us today. It confirms that the Lord isn't just the God of Israel, he's the judge of all the earth.
Okay, let's unpack this history then, starting with the land itself. We really need to set the scene for the Edomites, beginning with the very first inhabitants of this rugged place, who were the original residents of Mount Seir.
Well, before the descendants of Esau ever arrived, the land belonged to the Horites. The essay we're looking at points out that the word Horite itself is often translated as cave dwellers.
Cave dwellers. Yes. And if you visualize the land of Seir, I mean, this is where the stunning red rock canyons of Petra are located. It just makes perfect sense.
Ah, okay. I can picture that.
It's a land of massive cliffs, deep clefts, natural rock fortresses. These people lived literally within the stone defenses, so their identity was just intrinsically tied to this rugged terrain.
So the land really shaped the people, demanding a specific sort of sheltered lifestyle. And the identity of the people and the land were so deeply connected that the region actually took its name from a person.
That's right. The territory is named after a specific ancestral figure, Seir the Horite. He is the name giver, the eponym, as scholars would call it. His identity just becomes synonymous with the entire region.
So that really underscores that the land itself, Mount Seir, had this ancient, established heritage long before the Edomites even showed up.
Exactly.
Which brings us to Esau's inheritance. We know Esau and Jacob parted ways, so how did Esau's descendants, the Edomites, manage to take over this established, geographically fortified territory?
The process was a classic displacement. It's a really common pattern in the ancient Near East. Moses summarizes it very plainly in Deuteronomy. He says the descendants of Esau drove out, destroyed, and settled in the place of the Horites.
A complete takeover.
It was a complete territorial transfer. They wiped out the former inhabitants to establish the new nation of Edom. But the real insight here isn't how they took it, but why they were allowed to keep it unchallenged, specifically by Israel.
You're talking about the divine boundary, that critical point where God steps in to define ownership for a non-covenant people. Help me understand why God would extend that kind of protection to the descendants of Esau.
This is truly foundational to understanding God's, let's call it, universal governance. In that same chapter of Deuteronomy, when Israel was approaching the land, they were commanded not to pick a fight with Edom.
Not at all.
Not at all. Not to take any of their territory, not even a foot's length. And the reason is that the Lord explicitly stated he had given the hill country of Seir to Esau as his inheritance. This was a divine grant.
So God established borders, not just for Israel, but for the nations around them.
Yes, which proves that God is sovereign over all geography, even the land of a rival brother.
Wait, so God commanded Israel, who had all the covenant promises, who had the military strength, not to fight their neighbor because God had set that boundary. That seems completely counterintuitive to ancient war strategy.
It is.
What was the purpose of demanding that kind of restraint?
It was the ultimate lesson in humble obedience. Israel was being taught that their mission was not conquest for conquest's sake. It was conquest on God's terms, within God's boundaries. It proves that the global map is intentional, It's not accidental. God determines the time and place of every nation's existence, and he expects obedience to the boundaries he has set for them too.
And that spiritual principle connects directly to Edom's own spiritual failing. Let's talk about that geography, the wealth it provided, and what the essay calls the false sense of permanence. What was this terrain like physically that gave them such confidence?
Well, it was a fortress made of stone. We really need to visualize it.
Yeah.
Deep, narrow canyons and mountain passes that could be held by just a few armed men.
Wow.
And these passes led up to massive plateaus and high ridges. It was just naturally impenetrable to a foreign army. And the prophets, they understood this inherent security. They described the Edomites as people who literally live in the clefts of the rocks and hold the height of the hill.
So this physical security just naturally fostered this immense confidence.
Exactly. A pride that, it bordered on arrogance. They truly believed they were untouchable.
So their environment taught them self-reliance, but that confidence was then amplified by their economic situation. Where did the wealth come from that sort of cemented this sense of permanence?
Edom had a huge geographical advantage, which was crucial for trade. They controlled segments of the King's Highway,
Major trade route.
the major north-south route connecting Arabia with the Levant and Egypt. Their wealth flowed in primarily by taxing this constant stream of caravan traffic, charging duties on goods as they passed through their territory.
So it was secure, and it was profitable.
Very. They also traded goods like copper, which they mined from the Araba Valley, livestock, other valuable items. This constant inflow of capital, combined with the security of their mountain home, bred what the essay calls that false sense of permanence. They felt rooted in a way that just defied the very idea of eventual judgment or destruction.
So the core insight here is that their geology became their god.
In a sense, yes.
Their sheer wealth and their massive stone defenses taught them to trust in themselves, in the product of their own environment and their own effort, rather than in the God who actually granted them the land in the first place.
Precisely. And that self-reliance is the perfect explanation for their religious practices. If your security is in the rock and your prosperity is in trade, you're going to choose deities that affirm your current success and your military strength.
What do we actually know about the religion of Seir?
From names and surviving texts, we know that the chief deity for the Edomites was likely a god named Kuos. He was characteristically a storm god and a war figure, which aligns perfectly with a culture focused on maintaining defensive borders and military dominance.
And you see this in their names.
You do. We find evidence of this in personal names that included the deity's name as a component, a clear sign of devotion, which is referenced indirectly in texts from the period.
And the biblical prophets, of course, they understood the issue wasn't just geopolitical or economic, it was fundamentally about worship.
That's vital. The prophets, therefore, take aim not only at Edom's violence toward Israel, but also at its proud, self-reliant heart and its idols. They violated the very first commandment, to have no other gods. The ultimate sin was placing their trust in created things, the cliffs and the commerce, rather than the creator.
And yet, even in this land of rivalry, there is this beautiful sort of poetic paradox in Israel's memory, where God claims this space of Seir for himself.
It's truly stunning. I mean, despite being the land of a persistent, bitter antagonist, the name Seir sometimes appears in Israel's poetry and worship as a marker of God's powerful presence.
How so?
Poets sing that God majestically marched from Seir and from the region of Edom, using that name to mark a majestic appearance when the Lord rose to help his people in the days of old.
Wow, so it's a profound theological statement.
It is. It says that even the geographic spaces of the enemy lie under the Lord's feet. God is sovereign over the entire map, and he can use even hostile territories to stage his glory and deliver his people.
That provides such a robust historical foundation. Let's move now into the core biblical narrative, the relationship of Jacob's descendants and Esau's descendants, which, begins with kinship, but very quickly turns sour.
Right. The foundation is kinship and then immediate separation. Genesis tells us that Esau settled in Seir, formally establishing the nation of Edom. And this initial relationship is so crucial because it establishes the category of a brother.
Which makes the later hostility.
It makes it not just political, but a profound betrayal of kinship, which is exactly why the prophetic judgments are so severe later on.
And as we establish, Genesis makes a point of highlighting Edom's early strength.
Yes. Genesis provides that really detailed list of Edom's chiefs and kings, and it specifically notes that Edom had established kings before any king ruled in Israel.
So for a long time, Edom was seen as the older, more established nation.
And likely more secure, which would have been a natural source of maybe envy for Israel as they struggled through their own tribal period.
That context makes the first major point of conflict. Israel's path through the wilderness, a powerful test case. It's a collision of Israel's obedience with Edom's deep-seated hostility.
Absolutely. The passage in Numbers chapter 20 is a masterclass in divine restraint. Moses sends a very courteous request to their kin, asking to pass peacefully along the king's highway.
And Edom's response.
A full rejection, backed by a large armed force ready to fight. This refusal really established that ancient hostility early on. It shows a settled animosity toward their kin.
But Israel was provoked, yet they didn't retaliate, even though they probably could have. That restraint is the key lesson here, isn't it?
It is the ultimate lesson of discipline. Israel turned away and skirted the land, obeying the Lord's specific command not to strike at them because he had set that boundary. That detour, it wasn't a military retreat.
Yeah.
It was an act of profound, active obedience. It shows a kind of discipline that can sometimes be harder than fighting, knowing when to yield and when to respect a limit, even when you have the power to break it.
That patience, sadly, it fractured over time. The king's period saw centuries of conflict, which demonstrated the folly of trusting in human strength instead of divine help. Let's look at the example of Jehoshaphat's miraculous deliverance.
Right. Jehoshaphat faced a terrifying, massive combined invasion from Moab, Ammon, and men from Mount Seir. The odds were, humanly speaking, impossible.
So what did he do?
Instead of preparing a battle plan, Judah prayed and focused on the Lord, and God intervened miraculously. He turned the invaders against each other in confusion. The insight here is crucial. The Lord, not military preparation, was Judah's true defense. The enemy from Seir proved that trust in the Lord is the only real source of security. It confirms that our help comes only from the maker of the hills, not the hills themselves.
And then you have the tragic example of King Amaziah, who shows us that even a great victory can be a spiritual trap.
It really can. Amaziah achieved a stunning victory over Edom, capturing the key rock city of Selah. But pride followed that victory instantly.
What did he do?
He began to rely on his own military success, and in a fit of just absolute foolishness, he brought back the idols of the Edomites and started worshiping them.
No.
Yes, and this pride led directly to Judah's later defeat and downfall. The lesson is just so stark. The moment you trust your own success, your talent, your tactics, your resources, you are making the exact same mistake as the Edomites who trusted their physical cliffs.
And all these conflicts, they came to a head at the ultimate low point. The fall of Jerusalem. This was the moment of complete malicious betrayal that drew the final prophetic fury.
This was the culmination of that ancient hostility. When Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, the Edomites didn't just ignore the tragedy.
They celebrated.
They actively celebrated, they helped the looters, and they cried out for the total destruction of the temple and the city. The raw, malicious joy is captured in that horrifying cry recorded by the psalmist. Tear it down to its foundations.
That's just awful. Gloating over a covenant brother's suffering.
That was the severe offense that guaranteed judgment.
And this betrayal, it sparked an incredible concentration of prophetic judgment. Let's focus on the specific charges laid out by Obadiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel as they really zeroed in on Edom's pride and malice.
Obadiah's prophecy is brief, but it is pointed and devastating. He charged Edom with 3 core sins: standing aloof when Judah was attacked, handing over fugitives to the enemy, and actively looting the city in its distress.
And the verdict.
Absolute. Their great height would not hide them, and their malicious deeds would return directly on their own heads. It was a promise of reciprocal, unavoidable judgment.
Jeremiah then focuses on the root of the problem, that spiritual blindness caused by arrogance.
That's right. Jeremiah noted that their pride deceived them. He promised that terror would bring even their famous wise men low. Their overconfidence, which was bred by their geographical security, it just blinded them spiritually. They thought their self-sufficiency and their cleverness were enough.
And Ezekiel provided the perfect summary, using that term, ancient hostility.
Yes. Ezekiel named Mount Seir directly, citing its ancient hostility and its relentless bloodshed against Israel. He declared that God would make its towns desolate ruins so that all nations would finally know that he is the Lord. That settled, murderous enmity against their own kin was what incurred the most severe wrath.
And even after the immediate destruction, Edom continues to serve as this kind of case study, notably in Malachi, highlighting the severity of God's judgment.
Right. Malachi uses Edom as the ultimate negative example to remind the returned exiles of God's absolute holiness and justice. He calls Edom the wicked land, a nation God judged and would not allow to rebuild in defiance. He calls them a people always under the wrath of the Lord.
And that served a critical pastoral purpose for Judah.
It did. It reminded them that covenant status is not a license to presume upon God's grace. If God judged Edom this completely, Israel must fear and honor his name.
And then we get that powerful future vision in Isaiah, where God claims Edom as the staging ground for ultimate future justice.
That incredible vision in Isaiah 63 is one of the most solemn in all of prophecy. The Lord is pictured coming from Edom, his garments stained as if from a winepress.
What does that symbolize?
It symbolizes the day he will tread down the proud nations in ultimate universal justice, bringing final salvation to his people. And these scenes, they show the essential balance of God. He is both the covenant keeper and the impartial judge. He keeps score and he keeps mercy.
It's amazing that this hostility persists right up to the start of the New Testament. The echo of Edom shows up again with Herod the Great.
That's right. The Edomite line persists in the Idumeans. And Herod the Great, the ruthless ruler who was so threatened by the news of a newborn king that he ordered the slaughter of the innocents.
He was an Edomian.
He was an Edomian. It's a dark reminder that these old rivalries can echo in new ages. It shows that the hostility against God's redemptive plan is deep-seated and persistent across history.
But the gospel itself provides the radical answer to this history of division and these blood feuds between kin.
That's the stunning conclusion to this whole narrative section. Jesus broke down the dividing wall of hostility that separated Jew and Gentile. The gospel calls all who trust him, whether you're descended from Jacob or Esau or any nation, into one new humanity in himself. The wisdom of God's larger plan moves forward through the cross and the global call of faith, transcending all these ancient national boundaries and enmities.
So now we can move to the really serious theological implications. The story of Seir isn't just a lesson in rivalry, it's a lesson in how God runs the universe. And we start with God's absolute sovereignty over land and lineage, the fact that he is operating outside of the covenant with Israel too.
This is a fundamental concept, and it really challenges our assumptions. The Bible is clear that God gave inheritances not just to Israel, but also to Lot's descendants, that's Moab and Ammon, and to Esau.
And he did this before giving Canaan to Israel.
That's the key. He did this before he settled the grant of Canaan to Israel. This proves that God's care for borders is universal, and it's not limited to the covenant with Jacob. He is the ultimate landlord of the universe, and he defines all territorial claims.
And again, this keeps connecting back to that missionary purpose Paul outlined in Acts 17. God marked out the boundaries so that people might seek him. How does Edom's specific grant exemplify this purpose?
Well, it shows that every land, even the land of a hostile neighbor, is a stage for knowing God. Edom's grant of Seir was a real divinely established part of the common order. Their prosperity, their pride, and then their visible judgment. All of it provided a tangible lesson for Israel and for all the surrounding nations. The stage was set for them to seek the true God.
And they failed.
They failed by trusting their own height. Their rise and fall served to advertise the power of Yahweh.
But, we see judgment for pride. If God gave them the cliffs, why did he judge them for trusting those cliffs?
Because they committed the classic sin of replacing the giver with the gift. Edom's greatest error was placing its ultimate reliance on geology, on the cliffs, on their human wisdom, their military might. The prophets relentlessly mocked that false security. Height cannot hide you from the Lord's hand. God honors the boundaries he sets, but he judges the hearts and the allegiance within those boundaries.
And we must be clear, the judgment was entirely just. It wasn't some kind of celestial grudge.
Absolutely not. The judgment on Seir was entirely just punishment for real, tangible wrongs. The gloating, the looting, the betrayal of that brother-like kinship, they maliciously delighted in Israel's pain. Edom serves as the cautionary example of the neighbor who turns traitor in a crisis, and God held them absolutely accountable for their malice and their failure to show basic human kindness.
Okay, let's address the complex theological structure that's mentioned in the source material.
Yeah.
How does this history fit into the whole story of Scripture, especially when we talk about God's different ways of interacting with different groups at different times?
That concept, it's often called progressive revelation or viewed through distinct administrations. It simply means we recognize that God reveals his plan incrementally, and he governs different groups simultaneously under different rules. He runs, you could say, two main parallel tracks of interaction.
Two tracks.
Yes. First, His special covenant track with Israel, which is based on unconditional promises of salvation and restoration. And second, his track of general governance, where he holds all other nations, like Edom, to account based on general moral law and their deeds.
So the church, which includes people from every nation today, is on a sort of spiritual track, while Israel's national promises still await a literal earthly fulfillment.
That's the essence of the distinction. In this present church age, believers, Jew and Gentile alike, enjoy spiritual blessings through Christ and form one body. But the national earthly promises made specifically to ethnic Israel, promises of land, kingdom, and prominence, they await fulfillment when the king returns. The judgment on Edom confirmed that God keeps all his promises, both negative and positive.
Does that mean the vivid prophecies concerning judgment in Edom and nations streaming to Jerusalem are still literal future events?
Yes. The source material really emphasizes that these prophecies, the scenes in Isaiah or Zechariah, are not just metaphors that somehow cancel the history of Seir or abstract Israel's future hope. They are literal scenes in the same long divine plan, still to be staged at the proper time. Seir's destruction is both a literal historical event and a type of prophetic example, pointing toward the final universal judgment of the proud nations of the world.
How does the judgment of Seir help us balance justice and mercy? It seems like a story dominated by the weight of judgment.
It is a story of judgment, but it exists within a larger context of universal hope. While God promised and delivered repayment to Edom, the very same scripture that predicts doom also opens a door of hope to any person who calls on the name of the Lord.
So an Edomite who repented could have been saved.
Absolutely. Paul makes this universal. When he's explaining the gospel's reach, he says, "For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him." And the pivot point for all of us is the cross. The cross doesn't cancel God's right to judge. Instead, it displays that right and it satisfies it perfectly. This allows him to be perfectly just and simultaneously the justifier of those who place faith in Jesus.
That dramatically shapes our view of the future. What does the fate of Seir assure us of?
It assures us that the proud heights of this current age, all the seemingly permanent structures of human power, they will not stand. The vivid images of judgment running through Edom's terrain tell us that everything that exalts itself against God's name will be brought low. This is an unshakable kingdom we are entering.
And what attitude should that assurance create in us today?
It should not make us harsh or, triumphalist toward the world. It should make us sober, patient, and absolutely sure that the judge of all the earth will do right. We trust his future justice, and that confidence allows us to walk in humble patience and refuse to take vengeance into our own hands.
The journey through Seir is really meaningless unless it translates into practical action. Yeah. So what are the key spiritual lessons we take away from the saga of rivalry, pride, and divine consequence that affect our everyday decisions?
Well, the first, and I think most foundational lesson, is respecting God's boundaries and his timing. We have to revisit Israel's detour. They were powerful enough to fight Edom, yet they were commanded to pass by because the land was not theirs. Obedience, in this key moment, looked like powerful, disciplined restraint.
That's such a countercultural lesson. I mean, we are taught that if we have the resources or the authority to achieve something, we must pursue it aggressively.
And that's the spiritual trap. Not every open door is ours to walk through, and not every contest is ours to win. And this applies across the board, to churches considering debt, to businesses expanding into morally ambiguous areas, or even just to personal ambitions that might require violating established limits.
So wisdom compels us to pause.
Exactly. To pause and ask, has God actually given this to me? We have to move or yield with a clean heart, trusting his timing and limits, and realizing that sometimes restraint is the highest act of faith.
The second major lesson is guarding against modern pride, the equivalent of trusting the cliffs of today.
Right. Edom felt safe because their rock was high and their trade was rich. They boasted in their natural defenses. We have modern versions of those cliffs.
What are they?
Our robustness today, whether it's a massive savings account, a powerful professional network, a prestigious education, or social media position, all of that can function as a cliff under our feet. We are tempted to put our ultimate reliance on these structures for security instead of on the Lord.
So if the cliff represents false security, what is the practical antidote to that pride?
The antidote is active, ongoing worship, which reroutes our hope in the unshakable kingdom. We have to remember that the name of the Lord is a fortified tower, and we run to him not to our portfolios or our degrees. We hold wealth with open hands, setting our hope on God, not on riches, ensuring that any blessing we receive becomes a channel for generosity and ministry, and not a wall separating us from dependence on the true God.
The third lesson tackles the specific sin that really defined Edom: spite. It's a warning to guard against gloating over a brother's fall.
Edom's ultimate sin wasn't just political opposition, it was personal, malicious satisfaction. They rejoiced at Judah's ruin, they gloated, they blocked fugitives. God said, "You should not have looked on your brother's day." God counts that gloating, that malice toward another person's misfortune, as a real, serious wrong.
That is a critical lesson in an era defined by deep cultural and political divisions, where celebrating the misfortune of a perceived rival is almost commonplace.
And the church is called to show a profoundly better way. We must mourn with those who mourn, even those with whom we strongly disagree.
That's hard.
It is. We must refuse to profit, emotionally or otherwise, from another's pain. And this posture, it flows directly from remembering our own rescue. We extend mercy because we were shown mercy first, saved by grace alone.
Next, the story of Edom strengthens our hope in God's justice. If Edom, hidden away in its cliffs, was brought down, what does that assure us about the wrongs we see in the world today?
It assures us that the injustices and the wickedness of history, which often seem so tangled and seem to thrive in darkness, will eventually be judged. Edom looked physically and economically unassailable, yet God brought it down completely. This realization doesn't make us casual or vengeful.
What does it do?
It makes us prayerful and steady.
So we are called to leave room for God's wrath.
Precisely. We are instructed to be patient, refusing to repay evil for evil. We trust that God sees and records every injustice and will repay it. While we focus our energy on doing what is right and seeking the peace and good of our neighbors, we leave the timing and the consequence in His hands.
The Seir story also seems to widen our mission lens. It reminds us that grace crosses every physical and ethnic boundary.
It does. God sets borders, but His grace crosses them. The church is sent to every nation, even to those families that once stood in open opposition to God's people. The Apostle Paul felt a debt of love to both Jews and Gentiles, to everyone, because the gospel is universal.
So what does that mean practically in our mission efforts?
It means we must pray by name for the people in the hardest places, places that seem resistant to the gospel. It means welcoming strangers, offering hospitality, and speaking the gospel with patience and clarity, trusting the Holy Spirit to open hearts, just as He did for Lydia in Philippi. Our mission field is defined by the global boundaries God set for all people to seek Him.
And finally, how does all this history of judgment and sovereignty enrich our worship?
It makes our praise substantial, it gives it weight. The historical facts about Seir, the rise, the arrogance, the downfall, they enlarge our songs. When we sing of the Lord who keeps faith forever, who lifts up those who are bowed down, and who frustrates the ways of the wicked, we know this isn't just theory.
It's proven history.
It's proven history. We thank God that His kingdom cannot be shaken by the pride of man.
And it grounds us in the ultimate contrast, the meeting point of justice and mercy.
Yes. In the Lord's Supper, we remember a mountain greater than Seir Calvary, where mercy and justice met and converged through the sacrificial blood of Christ. And we wait for the King's return, remembering that He will judge the world and redeem all who trust in Him.
We have journeyed through Mount Seir's canyons and ridges, tracing the story of the Horites, the pride of the Edomites, God's patience in setting boundaries, and the promise of future justice. The core takeaway is just so clear. The Lord ruled through it all, allotting land, weighing hearts, judging wrong, and keeping covenant. The cliffs of this age will not last. The kingdom of God will.
In that history, that demonstration of divine sovereignty and consequence, it comes to a powerful, necessary point in the prophetic conclusion. The essay directs our eyes back to Ezekiel for the final warning and the final encouragement.
Could you summarize that concluding passage for us from Ezekiel chapter 35?
The word to Mount Seir was this: "Because you harbored an ancient hostility and delivered the Israelites over to the sword at the time of their calamity, you will be desolate forever. Then you will know that I am the Lord."
That warning is severe and it is specific.
It is a profound warning against allowing ancient harbored hostility to fester in our hearts. And it's a warning against gloating over the misfortune of others. That malice, that failure of kinship and kindness, it had absolute consequences. But the powerful encouragement is embedded right there in the end.
That He will be known as the Lord.
Exactly. God's justice is absolute, and in the end, He will be known as the Lord. His character will be vindicated through his steady, purposeful actions on the global stage, confirming that he alone rules all things.
May that assurance anchor us as we navigate our own lives and times, choosing mercy and humility over pride and spite, that you may walk in humble obedience, speaking truth and love, and finding your ultimate refuge, not in the passing cliffs of this world, but in the name of the Lord, our rock and our Redeemer.